The sisters who married their own brother. That's exactly what happened in 1902 in the fog-shrouded town of Port Blossom, Maine. 20-year-old twins Ara and Iselina sent a desperate letter to their older brother Caleb, begging him to come home and save them from poverty. But when he arrived at their decaying family house, he discovered something that would shatter everything he believed about family, love, and loyalty. Hidden in their mother's diary was a horrifying truth about their bloodline, a secret so dark it had driven her to madness. The twins weren't asking for rescue, they were setting a trap. And what they did to Caleb in that attic, chained and helpless, was beyond anything the law had words for. The entire town knew something evil lived in that house. But why did everyone choose silence over saving him? And how far would the sisters go to keep their family whole? The autumn fog clung to Port Blossom like a burial shroud, thick and suffocating, as if the very air sought to hide the secrets that festered within the town's weathered, clapboard houses. Caleb Morrison stood at the rusted iron gate of his childhood home, the letter from his sisters crumpled in his coat pocket, its desperate words burned into his memory. The house loomed before him, a monument to decay that seemed to exhale the stench of abandonment with each gust of October wind. Paint peeled from its shutters like diseased skin, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of neglect, and something far more sinister that he could not yet name. He had not set foot on this cursed ground for 3 years, not since the night he fled to Bangor, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a soul heavy with guilt. The timber camps had been his salvation, the back-breaking work of a foreman, his penance for leaving his sisters to tend their father's madness alone. But Ara's letter had shattered his carefully constructed peace. "We are starving, Caleb," she had written in her delicate script. "The townspeople will not trade with us, and we have sold everything of value. If you do not come, we shall surely perish before winter's end." The words had haunted him during the long train ride from Bangor, each clack of the wheels on the tracks echoing her plea. Now, as he pushed open the gate that screamed on its hinges like a wounded animal, Caleb felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle upon his shoulders. He was 28 years old, weathered by hard labor and harder choices, but in this place he felt again like the frightened boy who had once cowered in the root cellar while his father raged above. The front door opened before he could knock, as if they had been watching from behind the moth-eaten curtains, and there stood his sisters. Ara appeared first, a wraith in a faded blue dress that hung loose on her diminished frame. Her face, once round with youth, had grown sharp and hollow, her dark eyes too large for her skull. Behind her lurked Iselin, identical in features but utterly different in presence. Where Ara seemed fragile as spun glass, Iselin radiated a cold, unwavering strength that made Caleb's skin crawl. They were 20 years old, these twins, but the house had aged them in ways that had nothing to do with time. "Brother," Ara whispered, and her voice carried the weight of unshed tears. "You came." "Of course I came," Caleb replied, though the words felt strange in his mouth. The formality in their greeting, the way they stood side by side like sentinels, filled him with unease. "I received your letter. I'm here to help." Iselin's lips curved in what might have been a smile, but her eyes remained as cold as January ice. "Help," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Yes, Caleb, we knew you would help." The interior of the house assaulted him with memories and the sweet, cloying smell of decay. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light that struggled through grimy windows, and every surface bore the patina of neglect. The grand staircase, once their mother's pride, now sagged like a broken spine, its banister loose and treacherous. In the parlor, furniture sat shrouded in yellowed sheets like corpses awaiting burial. "The house needs work," Caleb said, more to fill the oppressive silence than from any real observation. "But it's structurally sound. We should be able to get a good price when we sell. Sell? Iseline's voice cut through the air like a blade. This is our family home, Caleb, our birthright. Why would we sell? Because you're starving, he replied, confusion creeping into his tone. Because the town has turned against you. Because there's nothing left for you here. The sisters exchanged a look that lasted only a heartbeat, but contained volumes of silent communication. Ara wrung her hands, a gesture he remembered from childhood, while Iselin regarded him with that unsettling half-smile. For 3 days, Caleb worked to make the house habitable, while the sisters watched with an intensity that prickled his nerves. He cleared debris, patched what could be patched, and began cataloguing their parents' possessions for sale. But every suggestion he made about their future was met with the same quiet resistance, the same meaningful glances between the twins. It was as if they were waiting for something, some sign or signal that only they could recognize. On the 4th night, a storm battered the coast with unusual fury, sending rain against the windows like handfuls of gravel. Unable to sleep in the oppressive atmosphere of his childhood bedroom, Caleb climbed to the attic to continue sorting through their parents' belongings. It was there, behind a loose board in the wall, that he found his mother's diary. The leather cover fell apart in his hands like dying flesh, and the pages within told a story that defied comprehension. His mother's careful script detailed years of unspeakable horror, of a husband who was not a husband, but a brother, of children born from an unholy union that had corrupted the very foundations of their bloodline. "The twins know," she had written in her final entry, the ink blotted with what might have been tears or blood. "They speak of it as destiny, as sacred duty. God help me, I fear what they will become when they are grown. They have made a pact, these daughters of sin. They will never be separated, they say, never be alone." The diary slipped from Caleb's nerveless fingers as the terrible truth crashed over him like a tide of filth. His father and his father's sister. The twins were not his sisters, but his cousins, born of incest and madness, and they knew. They had always known. He heard their footsteps on the attic stairs, soft and deliberate, and turned to find them ascending through the shadows like wraiths rising from hell. Ara's face was streaked with tears, but Iselin's expression remained serene, almost beatific. "You found it," Iselin said, her voice carrying no surprise, only satisfaction. "We wondered when you would discover the truth." "This is madness," Caleb whispered, backing away from them until his spine pressed against the slanted roof. "This is an abomination." "This is family," Iselin corrected, stepping closer. "This is love in its purest form, unmarked by the corruption of outsiders. Mother never understood, but we do. We have always understood. We wrote to you for a reason, Caleb," Ara added, her voice gaining strength. "Not for rescue, but for completion. We are 3 parts of a whole, and we have been incomplete without you." The realization struck him like a physical blow. They had not summoned him out of desperation, but design. Whatever twisted ceremony they had planned, whatever unholy ritual they believed would honor their corrupted bloodline, he was to be its centerpiece. In their eyes, he saw not the love of siblings, but something far more sinister, a hunger that had been feeding on itself in this house of horrors for 20 years. "We are a family that remains whole," Iselin said, echoing the very words their mother had feared. "And you, dear brother, will help us stay that way." The dawn that followed Caleb's horrific discovery brought no relief, only the cruel clarity of his imprisonment. When he descended from the attic, his legs unsteady beneath him, he found that every door leading to the outside world had been barricaded from within. Heavy furniture had been dragged against the exits during the night, and when he frantically searched for keys, he discovered they had vanished as completely as his hope of escape. The sisters sat in the parlor, serene as saints, in their moth-eaten dresses, watching his growing panic with expressions of patient understanding. "There is no need for distress, Caleb," Iselin said, her voice carrying the same maternal tone their mother had once used to soothe childhood nightmares. "You are home now. You are where you belong." "This is madness," he gasped, throwing his shoulder against the front door, but the oak held firm against the barricade beyond. "You cannot keep me here. People will come looking. My employer will send word when I fail to return." Ara rose from her chair with fluid grace, approaching him as one might approach a wounded animal. "But why would you wish to return to that lonely life, brother? Here we can be together as we were meant to be. Here we can honor the sacred bond that flows in our blood." "Sacred bond!" Caleb's voice cracked with hysteria. "What you speak of is an abomination before God and man. Our father was sick, diseased in mind and soul. Whatever corruption poisoned this house died with him." "You speak of corruption," Iselin said, rising to stand beside her twin. "But you understand nothing of purity. The world outside is filled with strangers who mate like animals, mixing bloodlines without thought or reverence. But we know better. We carry the essence of our family undiluted, unchanged. It is a gift, Caleb, a sacred trust." Over the days that followed, the sisters began their campaign of psychological warfare with the methodical precision of seasoned generals. They alternated their approaches like a carefully choreographed dance. Ara would approach him with tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks, speaking of loneliness and love, of how empty their lives had been without their beloved brother. She would press herself against him with desperate affection, her thin frame trembling with what seemed like genuine emotion. "I have dreamed of you every night since you left," she would whisper against his chest. "In my dreams, we are children again, playing in the garden before father's sickness consumed him. We were happy then. We can be happy again." But when gentleness failed to break his resolve, Iselin would emerge like a winter storm, her voice cutting through his protests with surgical precision. She spoke of duty and destiny, of the sacred obligation that bound their bloodline together. She recited passages from their father's journals, twisted interpretations of scripture that transformed abomination into divine commandment. "The pharaohs of Egypt married their sisters," she would say, pacing before him like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "The gods themselves took their siblings as consorts. What we offer you is not sin, but sanctification, not corruption, but completion." Caleb found himself caught between these alternating currents of manipulation, his mind fragmenting under the relentless pressure. He began to understand how their mother had succumbed to madness in this house of mirrors, where love and horror wore the same face. Sleep brought him no peace, for he would wake to find one or both sisters sitting vigil beside his bed, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like twin stars in the darkness. During the day, when exhaustion finally claimed them, he searched the house for evidence of their twisted history. In the root cellar, behind jars of preserves that had long since turned to poison, he discovered a wooden box containing artifacts that chilled his blood. 3 dolls carved from bone sat arranged in a circle, their faces bearing crude resemblances to himself and his sisters. Black ribbons bound locks of hair from all 3 of them, braided together in patterns that spoke of ritual and obsession. Most disturbing of all was a marriage certificate partially filled out in Iselin's precise script, waiting only for his signature to complete their unholy union. The outside world continued its existence beyond the barricaded doors, oblivious to his plight. When Dr. Alistair Finch arrived for his monthly visit to check on the sisters' health, Caleb felt hope flare in his chest like a struck match. But Iselin met the elderly physician at the door with a performance worthy of the finest stage actress. "Dr. Finch, how kind of you to call," she said, her voice warm with genuine seeming gratitude. "Our dear brother has returned from Bangor to help us set our affairs in order. The reunion has been such a blessing." Finch entered the parlor where Ara sat, embroidering a sampler, the picture of feminine domesticity. Caleb found himself forced into the role of dutiful brother, Iselina's hand resting with deceptive lightness on his arm, while her fingers pressed against the knife concealed beneath her shawl. "You look well, Caleb," Dr. Finch said, though his rheumy eyes held a sharpness that suggested suspicion. "Timberwork agrees with you." "Indeed," Caleb managed, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I have found it rewarding." The physician's visit lasted an eternity of forced pleasantries and careful observations. Finch's gaze lingered on the boarded windows, on the dust that spoke of long isolation, on the way Ara's hands trembled as she served tea in chipped china. But when he finally departed, Caleb's chance for rescue went with him, leaving nothing but the echo of hoofbeats fading into the fog. It was Sarah who provided the first real glimmer of hope. The young woman who delivered their weekly groceries had always shown him kindness during her brief visits, her honest face a stark contrast to the studied deception of his sisters. She was perhaps 25 years old, with auburn hair and eyes that held compassion instead of calculation. When she arrived with their order of flour and tinned goods, Caleb managed to catch her attention while Iseline counted out payment in the kitchen. "Miss Sarah," he whispered urgently, pressing a hastily scrawled note into her gloved hand. "Please, I beg you." She looked at the paper, then at his face, and something in his expression must have conveyed the desperation of his situation. Without a word, she tucked the note into her coat pocket, her eyes wide with sudden understanding. "I will return tomorrow," she said softly, loud enough for the sisters to hear, "with the remainder of your order." But as her wagon disappeared into the mist, Caleb saw Iselin watching from the parlor window, her pale face pressed against the glass like a spectre of judgment. Her smile was knife-thin and twice as sharp, and he realized with growing dread that nothing in this house of secrets would ever escape her notice. The sisters moved with the synchronized precision of creatures who had rehearsed this moment in their fevered dreams for 20 years. That evening, as the November wind howled through the gaps in the rotting shutters, they served Caleb his supper with unusual ceremony. They had prepared his favorite meal from childhood, roasted chicken with sage and carrots from their withered garden, while Iselin poured wine from a bottle that bore the dust of decades. The vintage had belonged to their father, she explained with reverent tones, saved for a sacred occasion that had finally arrived. To family, Iselin raised her glass in a toast, her pale eyes reflecting the candlelight like chips of winter ice. To bonds that cannot be broken by time or distance, or the ignorant judgment of lesser souls. Caleb hesitated, the glass trembling in his grip. Something in their manner had changed, a shift so subtle yet so profound that every instinct screamed danger, but hunger and exhaustion had worn down his defenses, and the wine tasted of memories from a time when this house had known laughter instead of madness. He drank deeply, seeking to numb the constant ache of fear that had become his companion. The first sign of treachery came, as drowsiness crept through his limbs like poison through his veins. His eyelids grew heavy despite the adrenaline that had kept him vigilant for days, and when he tried to rise from his chair, his legs buckled beneath him. Through the haze that clouded his vision, he saw the sisters watching with expressions of serene satisfaction, their faces wavering like reflections in disturbed water. "What have you done?" he managed to whisper, but his tongue felt thick and foreign in his mouth. "What love requires," Ara said softly, though her voice seemed to come from a great distance. "What destiny demands." The world tilted and spun as consciousness fled from him, and his last clear memory was of their hands upon him, surprisingly strong for such delicate creatures, dragging his limp form toward the stairs. The ascent to the attic became a nightmare journey through layers of shadow and whispered prayers, their voices blending in harmonies that spoke of rituals older than reason. When awareness returned, It brought with it a horror so complete that for several moments Caleb believed he had died and descended into the very depths of hell. The attic had been transformed into a grotesque parody of a wedding chapel, every surface draped with yellowed lace that might once have been white. Withered flowers hung in garlands from the rafters, roses and lilies long dead, but preserved through some unholy art that left them mummified rather than decayed. Candles burned in iron sconces, their flames casting dancing shadows that made the carved faces of ancestral portraits seem to leer and whisper. At the center of this macabre theatre stood an altar fashioned from their parents' marriage chest, its surface covered with a communion cloth stained dark with what might have been wine or blood. Upon it lay artifacts of their twisted heritage, the bone dolls he had discovered, a family Bible with pages torn and rearranged, and daguerreotypes of relatives whose faces bore the unmistakable stamp of inbreeding, the too close eyes, the weak chins, the hollow cheeks that marked generations of corrupted unions. But it was the sight of his sisters that truly shattered his sanity. They emerged from the shadows like brides risen from their graves, draped in their mothers' wedding gowns that had been preserved in trunks for decades. The silk had yellowed to the color of old bones, and moths had eaten holes that revealed glimpses of pale flesh beneath. Ara's dress hung loose on her diminished frame, while Iseline had altered hers with savage precision, the fabric clinging to her form like a shroud. Both wore wreaths of dead flowers in their dark hair, and their faces had been painted with rouge and powder that gave them the appearance of beautiful corpses. "Dearly beloved," Iseline began, her voice carrying the cadence of sacred ceremony, "we gather in this holy place to sanctify the union that God and nature have ordained. What blood has joined together, let no man put asunder." Caleb tried to speak, to scream, to shatter this nightmare with the force of his horror, but found that his limbs would not obey his will. The drug still coursed through his system, leaving him conscious but helpless, a prisoner in his own flesh. He could only watch as Ara approached the altar with a leather-bound book, their father's journal, he realized, with mounting dread. "From the writings of our beloved patriarch," she read, in a voice that quavered with reverence. "Let it be known that the pure blood of our line shall not be diluted by the corruption of strangers. Let brother cleave unto sister, and let their union be blessed by the sanctity of shared essence." The ceremony continued with vows that perverted every sacred word, transforming the language of holy matrimony into something obscene and damning. They spoke of eternal unity, not before God, but before their twisted understanding of divine will, of love that transcended the boundaries imposed by a world too crude to understand their exalted purpose. When they turned to him, expecting his participation in their profane ritual, Caleb found his voice at last. "No," he croaked, the word torn from his throat like a piece of his soul. "I will not be party to this abomination. I will not dishonor our mother's memory with this madness." The transformation that came over Iseline was swift and terrifying. The beatific expression melted from her face, replaced by a fury so cold and absolute that it seemed to draw all warmth from the attic air. Her pale eyes became chips of Arctic ice, and when she spoke, her voice carried the finality of divine judgment. "Then you have chosen damnation over salvation," she whispered, reaching for the iron candelabra that served as one of her altarpieces. "You have rejected the sacred duty that flows in your very veins." The blow came without warning, delivered with strength born of fanatical conviction. The heavy iron struck his temple with sickening force, and Caleb felt something fundamental break within his skull. Blood flowed hot and thick down his face as consciousness wavered like a candle flame in the wind. Through the haze of pain and shock, he heard Ara's voice raised in distress, but Iseline's cold command silenced her protests. "He has made his choice, sister. Now we make ours." They dragged his broken body to a corner of the attic where heavy chains waited, anchored to beams that had supported this house of horrors for generations. The iron links bit into his wrists and ankles as they secured him in the darkness, his blood pooling on the dusty floorboards beneath. As their footsteps retreated down the stairs, taking the light with them, Caleb Morrison faced the absolute destruction of everything he had believed about family, love, and the possibility of redemption. In the suffocating blackness of his prison, chained like an animal in the very heart of his family's corruption, he finally understood the true cost of secrets left to fester in darkness. Hope died in that moment, replaced by something harder and more terrible, the knowledge that some sins are too deep to forgive and some blood too poisoned to ever run clean. Time became meaningless in the suffocating darkness of Caleb's prison, marked only by the rhythm of his labored breathing and the steady drip of blood from his wounds onto the rotting floorboards. Hours dissolved into days as fever consumed his broken body, his mind drifting between waking nightmares and merciful oblivion. The chains that bound him had rubbed his wrists raw, and the metallic taste of his own blood had become as familiar as water. Yet somewhere in the depths of his delirium, as his physical strength ebbed away, like tide retreating from a dying shore, something unexpected began to take root in the ruins of his shattered spirit. It was his mother's voice that first pierced through the haze of pain and despair, not as memory, but as living presence in the fetid air around him. Her diary entries echoed in his fevered thoughts, each word a testament to suffering that had gone unwitnessed and unacknowledged for years. She had endured the same imprisonment, the same violation of everything sacred and pure, trapped in this house of horrors with no voice to speak her truth. The realization that his ordeal was merely the latest chapter in a legacy of silent agony filled him with something harder and more enduring than hope, the crystalline clarity of purpose that comes only to those who have lost everything else. "Justice," he whispered through cracked lips, and the word hung in the stagnant air like a prayer offered to an absent God. Not the justice of courtrooms and judges, for what law could name the crimes committed in this cursed place? But the deeper justice that demanded truth be dragged into light, no matter the cost to those who would drag it there. His mother had died with her secrets intact, her suffering unspoken and unmourned. He would not allow the same fate to claim him without a fight. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of his prison, Sarah had carried his desperate note through the fog-shrouded streets of Port Blossom like a woman bearing news of plague. Her hands trembled as she read the hastily scrawled words again and again, each repetition confirming the horror she had long suspected but never dared name. The Morrison house had always felt wrong to her, infected with a malevolence that made her skin crawl during her brief visits. Now she understood why the twins watched her with such predatory intensity, why their smiles never reached their eyes, why the very air around them seemed thick with unshed blood. She found Constable Matthias Thorne in his office above the general store, a weathered man of 50 whose patience had been tested by decades of dealing with Port Blossom's peculiar brand of willful ignorance. His grey beard was stained yellow with tobacco, and his blue eyes held the weary resignation of one who had seen too much of human nature to harbour many illusions about its fundamental decency. When Sarah burst through his door with Caleb's note clutched in her fist, Thorne's first instinct was to dismiss her concerns as the hysteria of an overwrought spinster. But something in her manner, the genuine terror that radiated from her like heat from a forge, gave him pause. "Constable Thorne," she gasped, pressing the crumpled paper into his reluctant hands. "You must read this. You must act. That man is in mortal danger." Thorne unfolded the note with deliberate slowness, his expression growing darker with each word he absorbed. The message was brief, but desperate. "They mean to keep me here by force. The things I have discovered about this family would damn them all. If you receive this, know that I am held against my will and fear for my very life." Send help before it is too late. Caleb Morrison. This could be the ravings of a man in his cups, Thorne said, though his tone lacked conviction. The Morrison family has always been peculiar, but accusations of imprisonment require evidence. Then come with me and see for yourself, Sarah pleaded. I have delivered goods to that house for 3 years, and I tell you something evil dwells there. Those women watch like hawks, speak in whispers, and that poor man looked ready to collapse from fear when he gave me this note. Dr. Alistair Finch arrived at the constable's office as if summoned by Providence, his black medical bag clutched in one gnarled hand, and concern etched deep in the lines of his weathered face. He had come to voice his own suspicions about his recent visit to the Morrison house, suspicions that had festered in his mind like infected wounds. "Thorne," he said without preamble, "I fear something terrible may be happening in that place. The atmosphere was wrong, poisoned somehow, and young Morrison, he looked like a man marked for death." The 3 unlikely allies made their way through the November dusk toward the Morrison house, their footsteps muffled by fog that seemed to thicken with each yard they traveled. The house loomed before them, like a ship of the damned, its windows glowing with the sickly yellow light of dying candles. When Thorne knocked upon the door, it opened with suspicious swiftness, as if they had been observed and expected. Iseline greeted them with her usual mask of serene composure, but Sarah noticed how her knuckles had gone white where she gripped the doorframe, how her pale eyes darted past them into the gathering darkness as if seeking escape routes or hidden watchers. "Constable Thorne, Dr. Finch, Miss Sarah," she said, her voice carrying its customary musical quality. "What brings you to our humble home on such a dreary evening?" "We've come to inquire about your brother," Thorne replied, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "There are concerns about his welfare." "Concerns?" Era appeared beside her twin like a spectre materializing from shadow, and Sarah saw immediately that something had shattered in the frailer sister. Her eyes darted constantly upward, as if following invisible movements across the ceiling, and her hands fluttered at her throat like trapped birds. "What manner of concerns?" "He left rather suddenly, didn't he?" Dr. Finch observed, his professional eye cataloguing every nervous gesture and telltale sign of distress, without a word of farewell or gratitude for hospitality received. "Our brother is a restless soul," Iseline replied smoothly, but her sister's condition was deteriorating with each passing moment. Era's breathing had become rapid and shallow, and a fine sheen of perspiration gleamed on her pale forehead despite the November chill. As they spoke, Thorne's trained senses detected something that made his blood run cold, the faint but unmistakable metallic scent of blood, not fresh but not yet ancient, hanging in the air like incense in a charnel house. His eyes swept the parlor, noting the dust patterns that spoke of recently moved furniture, the dark stain on the floorboards near the base of the attic stairs, the way both sisters positioned themselves to block his view of the upper reaches of the house. "Perhaps we might speak with him directly," Thorne suggested, taking a step toward the staircase, "to settle these concerns once and for all." "Impossible," Iseline said quickly, too quickly. "He departed for Bangor this very morning, the early train, you understand." But it was Ara who betrayed them, her fragile composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated guilt and terror. Her eyes flew upward once more, and this time a sound escaped her lips, half sob, half prayer, as she whispered words that condemned them both. "The attic," she breathed so softly that only Sarah's keen ears caught the words, "God, forgive us what we've done in the attic." In the sudden silence that followed her inadvertent confession, they all heard it, a faint, rhythmic banging from somewhere above their heads, as if someone weakened beyond endurance was using his last reserves of strength to strike metal against wood again and again and again. The rhythmic banging from above shattered the brittle facade of normalcy that Iseline had constructed with such meticulous care. Each metallic strike against wood echoed through the house like the tolling of a funeral bell. Ara's inadvertent confession hung in the air between them like a blade suspended over all their necks. And in that moment of terrible clarity, every soul in that parlour understood that they stood at the threshold of horrors that would haunt them for the remainder of their days. Constable Thorne moved with the decisive authority of a man who had finally seen enough evidence to act, his weathered hand falling to his pistol as he stepped toward the staircase. "Stand aside," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute law in a place that had known only the twisted justice of madness for too long. When Iselene moved to block his path, her composure finally cracking to reveal the desperate animal beneath, he simply pushed past her with the inexorable force of justice too long delayed. The ascent to the attic became a procession of the damned, each step revealing new depths of depravity that human minds had never been meant to witness. Sarah followed close behind, her face pale as morning fog, but her resolve unshakable, while Dr. Finch brought up the rear, his medical training the only thing keeping him functional in the face of such systematic evil. Behind them, Ara collapsed to her knees in the parlour, her sanity finally fragmenting completely as the weight of her crimes crashed down upon her fragile spirit. The sight that greeted them in the attic defied every notion of human decency that civilized society had constructed to shield itself from the abyss. The grotesque wedding altar stood like a monument to blasphemy, its surface stained with substances that spoke of rituals too obscene to comprehend. Withered flowers hung from the rafters like the corpses of hope itself, while candles guttered in their holders, casting shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life. But it was the discovery of Caleb himself that would sear itself into their memories, with the permanence of brands upon flesh. They found him chained in the furthest corner, barely recognizable as the man who had returned to Port Blossom, seeking only to help his sisters escape their poverty. His face was a map of suffering written in blood and bruises, his clothes torn and fouled, his body so weakened by days of imprisonment and torment that he could barely lift his head when light finally penetrated his prison. The chains that bound him had rubbed his wrists raw to the bone, and dried blood pooled beneath him spoke of wounds that had been left to fester in the darkness. "Dear God in heaven," Dr. Finch whispered, rushing forward with his medical bag as Thorne worked frantically to break the chains that held this broken man captive. "What devils walk among us in human form?" Sarah's strength failed her entirely at the sight, and she staggered back against the slanted roof, her stomach heaving as the full magnitude of the sisters' depravity became clear. The evidence of their crimes lay scattered throughout the attic like pieces of a nightmare puzzle. The bone dolls arranged in their obscene circle, the corrupted family Bible with its pages torn and rearranged to justify abomination, the daguerreotypes of ancestors whose faces bore the unmistakable marks of generations of inbreeding. When they finally freed Caleb from his shackles and carried his barely conscious form down from that chamber of horrors, the sisters offered no resistance. Iselene stood in the parlour with the serene acceptance of a martyr facing the flames, while Ara rocked back and forth on the floor, her mind having retreated to some safer place where the reality of their actions could not follow. As Thorne placed them under arrest, reading charges that seemed inadequate to encompass the scope of their crimes, both women maintained an eerie calm that spoke of madness so complete it had achieved its own terrible peace. The trial that followed became a sensation that drew reporters from as far away as Boston, though the nature of the sisters' crimes proved so disturbing that many details were deemed unfit for publication in respectable newspapers. The courtroom struggled with offenses that had no precedent in civilized law, crimes that existed in the shadowy spaces between kidnapping, assault, and something far more sinister that decent society lacked the vocabulary to name. Expert alienists testified to the sisters' fractured mental states, describing childhoods so warped by abuse and isolation that normal moral development had become impossible. In the end, justice took the form of institutionalization rather than imprisonment. The sisters were committed to the main state hospital for the insane, where they would spend their remaining years in separate wings, never again to coordinate their particular brand of madness. The verdict satisfied no one completely, least of all Caleb, who had expected the satisfaction of seeing them punished with the full weight of the law, only to discover that some crimes existed beyond the reach of conventional justice. The physical wounds healed with time and medical attention, but the scars upon Caleb's soul proved far more persistent. He found himself unable to return to his former life in Bangor, unable to pretend that the timber camps and their simple masculine camaraderie could ever again provide the sanctuary he had once known. Instead, he made the decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He chose to remain in Port Blossom, purchasing a small cottage on the outskirts of town where he could keep vigil over the truth that had nearly destroyed him. He became the guardian of his mother's story, ensuring that her silent suffering would not be forgotten or swept under the comfortable carpet of small-town amnesia. He spoke to anyone who would listen about the price of willful blindness, about the way communities could become complicit in evil through their very refusal to see what lay festering in their midst. Some called him obsessed, others pitied him as a man broken by trauma. But Caleb knew his purpose with the clarity that comes only to those who have looked directly into the abyss and somehow found the strength to climb back out. On a grey morning in early spring, 18 months after his rescue, Caleb stood before the Morrison house one final time. The structure had been abandoned since that terrible night, left to decay under the weight of its own corrupted history. Weeds choked the garden where he and his sisters had once played as innocent children, and the windows stared blindly out at the world like the eyes of a corpse. In his hand, he carried a can of kerosene, and in his heart, he carried the absolute conviction that some stains could never be cleansed, only burned away entirely. The flames took hold with eager hunger, consuming decades of accumulated evil in a purifying blaze that could be seen from every corner of Port Blossom. As the house collapsed into ash and ember, taking with it the last physical remnant of his family's shame, Caleb felt something approaching peace settle over his scarred soul. The truth had been told, the guilty punished according to their capacity for punishment, and the innocent finally given the voice they had never possessed in life. It was not the justice he had dreamed of in those dark hours chained in the attic, but it was justice nonetheless. Imperfect, costly and achingly necessary in a world where evil too often flourished in the silence of those who chose not to see.